The smell of butter sizzling in a pan filled the small kitchen as Emily stirred a pot of soup, her 6-year-old son, Jake, sitting at the table coloring. The old clock above the stove ticked away, reminding her that it was almost time to take Mr. Lawson his dinner. Emily had moved into this neighborhood almost a year ago, trying to escape the rising costs of the city. Her job at the diner barely covered rent and groceries, and she had learned to stretch every dollar. Still, she managed to cook a warm meal every night, making just enough to share with her elderly neighbor, Mr. Lawson. She had met him on a rainy afternoon when Jake's ball had rolled into his yard. She had apologized as she retrieved it, but instead of being annoyed, Mr. Lawson had simply smiled and invited her in. His house was clean but quiet, filled with old furniture that looked untouched. She had noticed the untouched loaf of bread on his counter, the unopened cans of soup in his pantry, and the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for a glass of water. "Do you have anyone to cook for you?" she had asked, trying not to sound intrusive. He had chuckled, shaking his head. "It's just me now. My wife was the cook in this house. Get by with canned food mostly." That conversation had stayed with her. No matter how hard things were for her, she couldn't imagine sitting alone at a table, eating from a can night after night. So, she started cooking just a little extra each evening and bringing it over. Jake hopped down from his chair, his drawing abandoned. "Can I come with you, Mommy?" Emily smiled, ruffling his sandy brown hair. "Of course, buddy, let's go." She packed the meal into a container, wrapped it in foil, and carried it next door. Mr. Lawson's house was only a few steps away, but it always felt like entering a different world. His home smelled of old books and polished wood, a place frozen in time. When Mr. Lawson opened the door, his face lit up. "Emily, Jake, come in, come in." Emily placed the food on his small dining table. "Chicken and rice tonight," she said. "Hope you're hungry." "Always," he said with a warm chuckle. Jake climbed onto a chair, swinging his legs as Mr. Lawson sat down to eat. Emily liked staying for a little while, chatting as he ate. It seemed to brighten his evening, and she had grown fond of the old man's stories about his late wife, his time in the army, and the neighborhood as it used to be. "You know, Mr. Lawson said between bites, I used to take my wife dancing every Saturday night. She loved to dance. Had 2 left feet, but it made her happy." Emily smiled, imagining a younger version of him, awkwardly dancing just to make his wife smile. "That's sweet." He nodded, his eyes distant. "You remind me of her, you know. She was always taking care of people, always making sure no one went hungry." Emily felt a lump in her throat. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just making a little extra food. But to Mr. Lawson, it seemed to mean the world. As they left, Jake tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, does Mr. Lawson have any family?" Emily sighed. "I don't think so, sweetheart." Jake frowned. "That's sad." She squeezed his hand. "That's why we visit." Walking back to their small home, Emily felt the weight of her own struggles pressing down on her. The rent was due soon, and she wasn't sure if she'd have enough after buying groceries. Her manager had cut her hours at the diner, making things even tighter. But she pushed those worries aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she had done something good. And that was enough. The next morning, Emily woke up before the sun, slipping out of bed quietly so she wouldn't disturb Jake. She stood in the small kitchen, staring at the stack of bills on the counter. The rent notice was on top, a glaring reminder that she needed to find a way to make ends meet. With a deep breath, she pushed the papers aside. Worrying wouldn't solve anything. She had a shift at the diner today, and she needed to focus on making it through the day. As she tied her apron behind the counter a few hours later, the familiar sounds of clinking silverware and low chatter filled the restaurant. It was a slow morning, which meant fewer tips, but she smiled at every customer, hoping for the best. "Coffee, please," a deep voice said. She turned to see Mr. Lawson sitting at the counter, his hands folded neatly on the surface. "Mr. Lawson," she said, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you here." He chuckled. "Figured I'd come see where you work. Haven't been out to breakfast in a long time." She poured him a steaming cup of coffee, watching as he took a slow sip. "You work too hard, Emily," he said after a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the restaurant. "Taking care of Jake, working long hours, bringing me food every night. When do you rest?" She forced a smile. "I get by." Mr. Lawson sighed, stirring his coffee. "You remind me of my daughter." Emily blinked. "I thought you didn't have any family." His expression grew distant. "She passed away a long time ago. Car accident. She was about your age when it happened." Her heart clenched. She hadn't known. "I'm so sorry." He nodded, looking down at his coffee. "She was a lot like you, always putting others first." Emily didn't know what to say, so she simply placed a slice of warm toast in front of him. "On the house," she said softly. He smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. The morning passed slowly, and by the time Emily's shift ended, her feet ached. She picked up Jake from school, and they headed home. She had barely set her purse down when there was a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Mr. Lawson stood there, holding a small tin box. "I wanted to give you something," he said. She hesitated, but stepped aside to let him in. Jake ran up to him. "Hey, Mr. Lawson." He chuckled, ruffling Jake's hair before setting the tin on the table. "This belonged to my wife. She kept little treasures in it. Notes, photographs, things that mattered to her." Emily ran her fingers over the aged metal. "Why are you giving it to me?" He exhaled. "Because I want you to know how much you mean to me. Ever since you started bringing me meals, I've felt less alone." Her chest tightened. "Mr. Lawson, you don't have to give me anything." "I know," he said with a small smile, "but I want to." She opened the tin carefully. Inside were faded photographs, a delicate lace handkerchief, and a stack of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon. "She wrote me letters every year on our anniversary," he explained. "Even when we were in the same house, she'd leave them for me to find." Emily swallowed hard. She must have been wonderful. "She was," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jake peered into the box. "These are really old." Mr. Lawson chuckled. "Older than you, kiddo." They sat together for a while, flipping through memories of a life well lived. Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she thought about Mr. Lawson's loss. He had built a life with someone who had loved him deeply, and now he was alone. She didn't have much, but she had Jake, and she had the ability to make someone else's days a little brighter. That had to be enough. For now. The days passed in a blur of work, bills, and quiet evenings spent with Jake. Emily kept cooking for Mr. Lawson, bringing him meals and sitting with him while he ate. It had become a part of her routine, something she looked forward to despite her own struggles. One evening, as she was washing dishes, her phone buzzed with a message from her landlord. The rent was officially overdue. She wiped her hands on a towel and stared at the screen, her stomach nodding. She had done everything she could, picked up extra shifts, cut back on groceries, even skipped meals when Jake wasn't looking. But it wasn't enough. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to stay calm. That night, after putting Jake to bed, she sat at the kitchen table and ran the numbers again. No matter how she twisted them, they didn't add up. A knock at the door startled her. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9. When she opened the door, Mr. Lawson stood there, leaning slightly on his cane. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. She shook her head. "Of course not, come in." He stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning her tired face. "You look worried." Emily hesitated. She never talked about her problems with him. He was the one she was supposed to be helping. "I'm just tired," she said finally. He studied her for a long moment. "Emily, I may be old, but I'm not blind. Something's wrong." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's nothing I can't handle." He didn't say anything right away. Then, softly, he asked, "Is it money?" Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Mr. Lawson nodded, as if he had already known. "I've seen people struggle before, you know. My wife and I had hard years too, but we always found a way." She swallowed hard. "I'm trying." "I know you are." He hesitated before continuing. "I want to help." Emily's eyes widened. "Mr. Lawson, no, I can't take anything from you." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn, just like my wife." She crossed her arms. "I mean it, I don't want charity." His expression softened. "It's not charity, it's gratitude. You've been taking care of me for months, Emily. Let an old man return the kindness." She shook her head. "Appreciate it, I really do, but I have to figure this out on my own." Mr. Lawson sighed but didn't push further. Instead, he pulled out a small envelope from his pocket and set it on the table. "If you ever change your mind," he said simply. She stared at the envelope, her throat tightening. After he left, she sat there, staring at it for a long time. But in the end, she didn't open it. She would find another way. The next morning, she woke up determined. She called the diner, asking for any extra shifts. Her manager agreed to give her a few more hours, but it still wouldn't be enough to cover the rent. Later that afternoon, she picked Jake up from school, his small hand slipping into hers as they walked home. "Mommy, can we make cookies for Mr. Lawson?" he asked. She smiled despite her stress. "That's a great idea." They spent the evening baking, the tiny apartment filling with the warm scent of vanilla and chocolate. Jake carefully placed the cookies in a tin, and they walked next door together. Mr. Lawson opened the door, his face lighting up. "What's this?" "Cookies," Jake announced proudly. Mr. Lawson smiled, stepping aside to let them in. They sat together while he sampled one, nodding in approval. "Delicious." Jake grinned. Emily watched them, her heart full despite everything weighing on her shoulders. After a while, Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. "Emily, I want to ask you something." She looked at him curiously. "I have a friend," he said slowly. "He owns a small business and he's looking for someone reliable. I told him about you." Her brows furrowed. "Mr. Lawson." "Just hear me out," he said. "It's better pay than the diner and more stable hours." Emily hesitated. The diner wasn't perfect, but it was familiar, and the idea of starting over somewhere new terrified her. But then she thought about the overdue rent, the dwindling groceries, the exhaustion of working long shifts for so little. She exhaled. "What kind of job?" Mr. Lawson smiled. "Office work, receptionist mostly, answering phones, keeping things organized, nothing fancy but steady." She bit her lip. "I don't know." "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "Just think about it." Emily nodded, but her mind was already racing. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about what this could mean. More money, more time with Jake, stability. But also change, and change was scary. She didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in a long time, she had hope. Emily spent the next few days thinking about Mr. Lawson's offer. The idea of changing jobs made her nervous. The diner wasn't perfect, but she knew what to expect there. A new job meant learning new things, meeting new people, and stepping into the unknown. But every time she opened her fridge and saw how little food was left, or every time she checked the mailbox and found another bill she couldn't pay, she knew she couldn't afford to be afraid. One evening, after dropping off dinner at Mr. Lawson's house, she finally gathered the courage to ask, "Do you think your friend would still be willing to give me a chance?" Mr. Lawson smiled warmly. "I was hoping you'd ask. I'll call him first thing in the morning." True to his word, the very next day, Mr. Lawson arranged for Emily to meet his friend, Mr. Harris, who owned a small accounting office in town. Emily showed up nervously, dressed in the best clothes she had, her hands gripping her purse tightly as she stepped inside. Mr. Harris, a kind-looking man in his 60s, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Lawson told me a lot about you," he said. "Said you're hardworking and dependable." Emily smiled shyly. "I try my best." He led her into his office and explained the job. It was mostly answering phones, scheduling appointments, and keeping files organized. Nothing too complicated, he assured her. And the pay, Emily almost couldn't believe it. It was nearly double what she was making at the diner. "I'd love to hire you, Mr. Harris said after they spoke for a while. "Lawson has always been a good judge of character, and if he trusts you, that's good enough for me." Emily felt relief wash over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Mr. Harris smiled. "Actually, I do." She blinked in confusion, and he continued. "Lawson told me about what you've been doing for him. Bringing him meals every night, keeping him company, making sure he's taken care of. That kind of kindness is rare, Emily." She swallowed hard. "I wasn't expecting anything in return. I just didn't want him to be alone." "I know," Mr. Harris said, "and that's exactly why you deserve this." Emily left the office with a job offer in hand, tears prickling at her eyes. She could hardly believe it. That evening, when she brought Mr. Lawson his dinner, she set the container down and turned to him. "Why did you do this for me?" she asked softly. He looked at her with kind eyes. "Because you did something for me when you didn't have to. You gave me a reason to look forward to dinner again. You treated me like family when I had no one left. And now, I get to return the favor." Emily wiped at her eyes before the tears could fall. "I don't know how to thank you." Mr. Lawson chuckled. "You already have." That night, for the first time in a long time, Emily went to bed feeling hopeful about the future. Emily's first day at the new job felt like stepping into a different world. The office was quiet and orderly, a stark contrast to the noisy, fast-paced diner. She sat at a desk near the front, answering phones and organizing paperwork, her nerves slowly settling as she got the hang of things. Mr. Harris was patient, guiding her through her tasks with kindness. "You're doing great," he assured her more than once. By the end of the day, Emily felt exhausted but proud. She had taken a chance, stepped out of her comfort zone, and it was already paying off. That evening, as she and Jake sat at their tiny kitchen table, she told him about the new job. "It's different," she admitted, "but I think I'm going to like it." Jake grinned. "Does this mean we can get more snacks?" She laughed. "Yes, buddy, I think we can." The next few weeks passed in a steady rhythm. Emily adjusted to her new job, learning more each day. The regular paycheck allowed her to catch up on rent and fill the fridge with fresh food. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to constantly worry about making ends meet. She still visited Mr. Lawson every evening, bringing him dinner and sitting with him while he ate. But now, there was something different between them, a quiet understanding that they had helped each other in ways neither had expected. One evening, as they sat together, Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd feel useful again after my wife passed." Emily looked at him, surprised. "You are useful." He smiled. "Maybe, but before you and Jake started coming around, I felt like I was just waiting for the days to pass. Now, I look forward to dinner. I look forward to hearing about your day." Emily reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We need you, Mr. Lawson, you're family now." His eyes shimmered with emotion, and he nodded. "That means more to me than you know." As the weeks turned into months, Emily's life continued to improve. She saved up enough to buy small things that made their apartment feel more like a home: a new lamp for Jake's room, a warm blanket for the couch. And one afternoon, after receiving her paycheck, she did something she had been wanting to do for a long time. She walked next door to Mr. Lawson's house, holding a small envelope in her hands. When he opened the door, she handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. She smiled. "The envelope you left me weeks ago. I never opened it." He looked at her surprised. "Emily." "I needed to figure things out on my own," she said gently, "and I did. But now, I want you to use this for yourself. Maybe fix up the house or get something you've been wanting." Mr. Lawson chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn, just like my wife," he murmured. Emily grinned. "You've said that before." He sighed, tucking the envelope into his pocket. "All right, but only because I know you mean it." She nodded. "I do." That night, as she tucked Jake into bed, he looked up at her sleepily. "Mommy." "Yeah, sweetheart." "I'm glad we met Mr. Lawson." Emily smiled, brushing his hair back. "Me too." As she turned off the light and climbed into her own bed, she let out a deep breath. Life had been hard. There had been moments when she wasn't sure they would make it, but kindness had found its way back to her, just as she had given it to someone else. And now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living.